Hi and welcome to this next video. In this video we're going to be taking a look at a pair of chronographs. We have a Landron 248 powered Oriosa here and a lovely Valjoux 7730 powered O and W. And thanks to the magic of Google, I have discovered today, only today, although I've been aware of this brand for long enough, that the correct pronunciation is actually Ollech Wajs, which is a little unusual. It was one that I wasn't at all sure how to pronounce because the spelling, as you can see down here, is a little bit of a tongue twister. But Ollech Wajs, for anyone who's wondering. Now this particular one I shall be looking at later because this was sent in to see what could possibly be done with it, so I shall pop that aside. And what we're going to do is start looking at and disassembling the O and W Valjoux 7730. On the back of the case we have waterproof, chronograph 20 Atmos and a serial number, and the use of the word waterproof indicates that it is quite old, and in this case it's probably 60s because it does have a shock protected balance where the non-shock watches tend to be 50s. I believe the use of the word waterproof was changed to resistant in the 70s. So we've got some service marks inside of the case back that you can probably just see there if I tilt that. So it has been looked at, as it were, in the past. And we have got a gasket that is either too small or has just shrunk from being sat in there. And I have already had a little bit of a prod about inside here. The functions are all working as they should. The problem with this particular one is the minute recorder sticks, or rather the chronograph runs, gets around to around 58 seconds, 59 seconds, and then stops. The whole watch stops. And this is because it's binding up when it gets to the minute recorder change, for the minute recorder hand to jump over to reflect 1 minute. Now this can only be down to some kind of binding either in the intermediate wheel here or the minute recorder wheel. I've already had a little bit of a dig around and I know that it's the minute recorder wheel. This is unnaturally stiff. It shouldn't be as sticky as it is. It should essentially be free sitting in here with zero or very, very minimal friction. You can move it round physically, as you can see, but it is unnaturally stiff. Having already adjusted the eccentric to take the intermediate meshing wheel away from the pointer, which resets it, the watch does continue to run. So again, this is evidence that it's either this or this part here. And as I say, I have already ascertained that it's the minute recorder wheel. There's a very, very slight bend, I think, on the pivot, and it is causing friction, and it's enough friction to prevent the chronograph turning over the minute recorder wheel. So this will most likely need a replacement minute wheel runner. What we're going to do is uncase this. And the first thing I need to do is get the correct size screwdriver so that we can remove the stem. Now normally these old chronographs are front loading movements and they are typically held with casing screws opposite one another, and then the bezel would pop off and the movement comes out from the front. In this case I happen to know that it is a rear loading movement with a fitted movement ring, and it is a little tight and needs a little bit of encouragement to start coming out. There we go, you can see that that's lifted, and pop that over like so, and that's the movement now uncased. I'll put the stem back in, which will enable us to align the hands. The hands are in really nice condition, showing stained and aged original loom, which is really nice. This is a tritium loom, denoted by the Swiss made T logo, and that's nice to know that I'm not being horrendously irradiated whilst exposed to the dial. But it's in very good condition, no obvious crumbling or anything of that nature. So I'm just going to remove the subdial hands carefully with very nicely thinned hand levers, so that you can get right in under the hand and lift it off without damaging the hand or the dial. And you'll note that the small seconds and the minute recorder are different shapes. The minute recorder having an arrow head rather type shape, and the small seconds being a simple straight hand, which if I can get that to sit nicely, I will just show you just there. Hopefully that's visible enough. And we now have a little bit of a wiggle and remove the movement casing ring, which as you can see has the cutouts for the stem and the pushers. Put that aside with the case. This now gives us access to the dial feet screws. Finding the appropriate size screwdriver. These are very, very tiny screws. One of which was loose, unusually. Loose screws on a watch are never a particularly helpful thing, because there's always a possibility that the dial has been moving and catching the hands, causing problems otherwise unknown. So once I've removed this, I'm going to double check the there's the dial there. Lovely dial, very nice, and pop that to one side to keep it safe. I am going to double check the minute wheel now that I've removed that dial, just on the off chance that there was movement in the dial and it was catching. I'm fairly confident that that wasn't the case, and that does still look off center to the hole that it's passing through. You can see the typical layout on this side. You've got setting lever, yoke spring, and then your setting lever, spring and cover plates for your minute wheel, and then your cannon pinion, and that's essentially the entirety of the dial side. Obviously you've got an Inca block shock setting there. Here is the protruding pivot for the minute recorder. Here is the protruding pivot for the sweep seconds, and that's the fourth wheel that you can see there. There's the barrel arbor, and it's in exceptional condition. Many of these old chronographs, having been run without being serviced, at regular intervals, wear great big ovals or just grind away these barrel arbor posts, and you get a lot of play in the barrel arbor. You'll have noticed that this has been mentioned in several 6139 videos, my own and other people's. It's not an exclusive problem to Seiko 6139s. It does happen on other movements. You will see it quite commonly on Landerons, for example, because they were a typically more mass-produced, cheaper chronograph, as it were. So they tended to be neglected a bit more. And the same story is with Seiko. The 6139s were actually a more affordable chronograph at the time, and unfortunately as a result of that they tended to be neglected. And this is something that tends to happen in the world of mechanical things. I worked as a mechanic for many years, and the number of times I've heard somebody say such and such a car is rubbish because I know someone who had one and it only did 40,000 miles and it needed a complete engine rebuild. But then you say to them, how many times during those 40,000 miles was the car serviced? How many times did it go in for an oil and filter change and such? And the answer is usually it went in for the first complimentary one and then they never bothered again because it was a cheap car. But then the same people will laud a more expensive family car, saying how great it is, but because it's more expensive they'll have taken it in for regular routine servicing, hence the reason it performed better and for longer. And although the Seiko is a much more budget in terms of construction movement, it uses a lot of stamped parts and the like, that is one of the intrinsic problems of cheaper watch movements. They tend to be more neglected than the more expensive watch movements. Exactly the same as cheaper cars versus more expensive cars. Anyway, enough with the postulating and such. Let me find a movement holder which will accommodate this lovely, lovely thing. So we need a 31. There we go. Apologies in advance for some slightly shaky footage, but I thought I would take this opportunity to just borrow one of my cleaning machine jars to stand the movement on and get this up close to the lens, which is a macro lens, which I keep kind of forgetting. And we can get some nice close-ups so you can have a look. Now, as you can see, we've got 17 jewels and the word 17 and Ollech Wajs, which admittedly I thought was pronounced something like was originally, but there you go, Ollech Wajs, interesting. And we can see the jeweled center wheel, center chronograph wheel and minute wheel respectively. The hammers which are currently on the hearts of said wheels, the fourth wheel driving wheel just over here, the clutch which couples the, coupling clutch to give it its correct name, which couples the fourth wheel driving wheel with the center chronograph runner, which uses those tiny teeth to ensure cleaner meshing and less of a jump. If any of you have ever wondered why a chronograph runner has tiny teeth and then the meshing coupling clutch wheel has big, huge shark teeth, as it were. And that is the sprung coupling mechanism for the minute recording wheel, which pops up so that the finger, which is in that little circle of the chronograph runner, which you can't quite see, turns over the intermediate wheel, and that in turn turns over the minute recording wheel. There's the hammer, and you can clearly see the origins there of the Valjoux 7750 layout of the hammer cam operated setup. Much more evident in the later 7733s and so on. There we've got the Inca block shock setting for, oops, I'm going to try and get that. There we've got the Inca block shock setting for the upper balance jewel. And let's just focus down a little. There you can see a very nicely formed, good condition hairspring, which is always a joy to behold. And just below that, the pallet fork, which is in very nice condition. I suspect this watch has not had a great deal of use. I suspect it was used for a while and then has ended up in storage because it's got minimal wear on many of the parts that you often see wear on vintage chronographs. So that's really, really nice to see. It's also had servicing in the past because there are a couple of servicing marks in the case, and that's also nice to see. It means that somebody has really appreciated and taken care of this watch. And just while we are here in close-up, if I can scoot this over accordingly, I will show you the release for the click. Should anybody be wondering how you release the power from the mainspring on a fully wound one, just down here under the hammer, if I turn, oh, there we go, and there you can see the click. So you can pop a very fine screwdriver into there and hold that back to release the power. So we'll zoom back out to the full screen so we can see what's going on, and we'll begin the disassembly. A brief pause at this point here just to point out, when working on Swiss chronographs, it's always advisable with this type of chronograph to remove the balance and the pallets, because while ever this wheel here, this extended fourth wheel, driving wheel, is fitted, every time you catch or brush or knock any of these wheels up here, you have the possibility of catching this wheel, which will force the escape wheel teeth against the pallet stones and could potentially damage it. So it's always advisable to remove the balance and the pallets after removing the power from the mainspring, as mentioned regarding the location of the click here. Before you go ahead and do anything else, because you cannot easily remove this fourth wheel driving wheel until at least some of the chronograph components have been removed from the top. So the simple solution to save damage to the pallets is just to remove the pallets. At this point here, we can begin to remove the chronograph components, and the first item I'm going to remove here is the tension spring. Whoops, get this on screen for you. Is the tension spring. A brief pause and zooming in here just to take a look at the underside of the chronograph bridge. And you can see what we've got here are some score marks, some quite deep, unpleasant looking score marks, and similarly some score marks on the underside of the chronograph bridge itself, and what looks like file marks over here. Now this relief here is for the chronograph wheel, the chronograph runner tension spring, which, as you can see, provides some relief tension on the main chronograph runner. And the other side should not be scored like that. It may well be that the original one should be chamfered, but that has most definitely been addressed with a file. And I suspect that at some reason the belief has been that the end shake needed to be increased, hence the gouges, which you often similarly see on underneath balance cocks, like down here. Well, obviously there aren't any here, but you'll often see marks like these underneath balance cocks. And I suspect that somebody in the past has assumed that the stickiness of the minute recorder is, rather than being a fault in here, which it still is, I can actually still feel that sticky, but we'll look at that in a moment. I suspect what they've done is they've had the gouges to try and increase the end shake a little, and then for some reason they've maybe assumed that the other side of it was catching somehow, or it needed to be tilted somehow. That's a little bit of a shame on an otherwise really, really nice condition watch, but it should still be usable. The jewels look good, and I will give a closer inspection to those, but they do look good. So I'm just going to pop the chronograph runner out so we can get this out of the way and safe. This of course just lifts straight up and out, and I'll just show you that. That's the minute recorder finger, and then of course the heart for the reset there. This is the tension spring, which is a nice forked shape for the chronograph runner to sit in. And again, this is something you'll see sort of carried over to the Valjoux 7750. What I noticed yesterday when I was investigating it was that this should quite literally just drop in and drop out. Now you can see it's sticking about halfway there. There's some friction, some unnecessary tension and friction somewhere in there. And while it's easier than it was yesterday, because I did have a little try last night at straightening that pivot, there is still some, oops, I'm off the screen, apologies. There is still some stickiness, some friction in there. So where that should just simply lift up and drop back down under its own gravity, you can see that that's not happening. In this case, what I am going to recommend is a replacement minute recorder wheel, and it's hard to see on here, but there is a very, very slight bend in that, which has probably happened just from excessive pressure when fitting the minute recorder hand, or possibly slipping during fitting the minute recorder hand. These do bend very, very easily if you're not very careful. A brief note about the eccentrics. Most of you, if you've watched chronograph videos before, will be aware, but obviously certain screws, or what appear to be screws standing proud, like this one here, and this one here, and this one here, are actually eccentric bolts, as it were. They don't unscrew. They just swivel around on an eccentric post, and they can adjust the meshing of various chronograph components. If the meshing of a chronograph is perfectly fine, leave them alone. Do not touch them, because the fine adjustment can be tricky and time consuming. What's left to remove are the operating levers. So we have one conventional left-handed screw, which comes out like so, and you see there that there is a spring for these as well. And then we have two right-handed screws, as in left-hand thread. So to loosen them, you turn it clockwise. These are denoted, of course, by the triple slotted screw heads. As I usually do when working on chronographs, oh boy, that's tight. When removing the spring for the chronograph components, make a note of the orientation. Often these springs will go in both orientations, but there is only one correct orientation. So in this case, the longer portion goes to the start-stop side. There are now only two parts remaining. One of those parts is the chronograph bridge, which is kind of like an intermediate bridge. Now this, if you've watched the Breitling Cadet video, will look very familiar, because the premise of the chronograph bridge, the intermediate bridge, is exactly the same as on the Venus that we serviced in the Breitling Cadet video. And these particular movements were in fact used in Breitling models such as the Top Time. So there you can see a bit more clearly now the click that you can access through that hole. And the only component remaining to remove is the extended fourth wheel driving gear. My preference for removing these, is using hand levers. I find I have more control if you have the access and you can get them in. In this case I can. You can get those right underneath there, and it gives you a little bit more control, and you can take it nice and easy. These usually come off without too much fuss, as you can see there. And if you cannot get the hand levers in, you can sometimes use two thin screwdrivers. Be very careful if you do. Make sure you polish the blades to avoid scratching the plate. And of course, failing that, there's the Bergen Presto tool. Note that this goes in a certain orientation. The larger portion visible there goes underneath, and ideally these should be fitted using a staking set or a jeweling tool press when refitting, because again it's very easy to press down and slip and bend that pivot, and then you're in for a world of troubles, leaving you with the only real option of replacing that fourth wheel. And using a staking set or a jeweling tool ensures that you get that dead straight, and you can also verify that the meshing is accurate. This is the last part to be fitted after rebuilding the chronograph works, although it's the last part that you remove after removing them, and you do this to ensure that this meshes correctly with the coupling clutch. So that's our chronograph disassembled. Next step, onto the movement, which I am probably going to put in a separate video because this one I suspect is going to be quite long already.